The best thing about a Mageblade is that your flasks have 100% uptime, therefore allowing you to increase their effect. The worst part of a Mageblade is it's pretty darn expensive, and also takes up your belt slot. So the next best option is to be a Pathfinder. This lets you use any belt in the game, and also has a lot of bonuses for chaos damage. But maybe you can't be a Pathfinder, because you need to be in another part of a tree to play your build. Well, in that case, you're going to need to get a little bit more creative. And today I want to talk about one of the creative ways which players use to increase their flask uptime, allowing them permanent flasks like you see here. And so in today's video, I'm going to break down how I'm getting 100% flask uptime, some of the use cases and builds it synergizes with. If you want to know more about the specific build I'm playing, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and look out for a future video on that. But for now, how does my coruscating elixir have 100% uptime, and why would I want that? First up, if you are using coruscating elixir to run a low-life build without a Chevron's wrapping, chaos damage will naturally bypass your energy shield whenever the flask is down. This effectively means that whenever there's any downtime in your flask, you will immediately die to any chaos damage you take, because you're going to have a couple hundred life at most, ideally 1 or 2 life unreserved. And that's not really very much of a buffer. Sure, maybe a fraction of a second of a dot tick won't kill you, but even then poison hits relatively hard. Alternatively, if you're playing a ward loop build, well, you need a flask to keep your ward active, and the second your ward isn't active, your damage will immediately kill you. And last I checked, dying is a 100% DPS loss. So in both of these cases, you're going to need 100% uptime on your flask. And let's go into exactly what that entails with the coruscating elixir example. The flask has a duration of around 12 seconds. It uses 20 out of 50 charges on use, which means you need to get around 1.67 charges per second to get 100% uptime, at least assuming if you are consistently gaining charges every second. In most cases, there's an interval of time there, such as 1 charge per 3 seconds, 1 charge per 5 seconds, etc., etc. You'll need to tailor this approach depending on what you're using. And in my case, I am using the Traitor Keystone, which gives 4 flask charges per 5 seconds per empty flask slot, which is why you see the 2 empty flask slots on my bar. The Traitor is a timeless conversion keystone gained through the Brutal Restraint Jewel, denoted in service to the Dakara in the Akara of Balbawa. Since that's a whole bunch of things that you probably don't recognize unless you've dived into PoE lore, what you need to know is Brutal Restraint Balbawa. Everything else on the jewel does not matter, and you must allocate 1 keystone in radius. It will convert all keystones in radius, though, so be careful that you don't need the second one for anything. This does not convert over your notables. It adds dexterity to the small nodes and adds special passives to the notables. Thus, you want to put it in an area with a keystone you are not using and as many notables that you are using as possible. The seed will determine the exact effect granted to these notables. In my case, it's 10% increased flask charges gained on all 3. So to go back to the above example, to get 20 charges in 12 seconds, well, I need to get 20 charges in 10 seconds because it ticks once every 5. 2 empty flask slots is 8 charges every 5 seconds as a baseline, which gets me to 16 out of the 20 needed in 20 seconds. 30% increased flask charges gained rounds this up to 10.4 in 5 seconds or 20.8 in 10 seconds. Thus, 10 seconds is less than the 12 seconds of flask duration, and overall, the flask should refresh every 10 seconds with 0 chance at downtime. When using a setup like this, it's really easy to maintain flasks that consume a low number of charges. But to maintain flasks with higher levels of consumption, you're going to need to get creative. When it comes to a defensive flask, you absolutely cannot have gaps. I would never advise using a high consumption defensive flask that must be up at all times. The highest consumption flask that I've seen people manage to make work is the Olrath's Resolve, which uses 56 to 60 charges on use, and is important if you're playing a ward loop build. In this case, you don't get to just throw on the Traitor and call it good. Instead, you have to combine this with reduced flask charges used, say from a belt modifier, increased flask effect duration from a belt modifier, increased flask charges gained, flask duration clusters, or even the Pathfinder Ascendancy to get you more charges per second. This is the extremely hard mode level, but there are some that I would consider to be difficulty impossible, like the Cinder Swallow Flask. The Cinder Swallow urn consumes up to 200 charges, and I'm just going to be blunt here, even if that was your only flask, you are not going to be generating 200 charges in an efficient manner without severely gimping your character. So there is a limit to this, but it can be highly effective if permanent flask uptime is important to your build. So I've already vaguely covered some of the important ways in which the Traitor is used. Now I'm going to get into a couple of small specifics. So here we have a word loop build, which is a cast on damage taken build where you're constantly dealing damage to yourself via heartbound loop, and you're mitigating that damage via ward. In this case, the way to get flask uptime to 100% is increased flask effect duration, reduced flask charges used, a flask cluster, and of course investing in the Pathfinder Ascendant sub-ascendancy. This is also why there's only one flask slot open instead of the two that I was talking about in my setup earlier. There's quite a lot of investment here, and quite honestly, I wouldn't advise this unless you're getting something on par with a ward looper where you can just walk through the game dealing massive amounts of damage. Giving up one flask slot or two flask slots is a significant investment into your character, and there's always an opportunity cost there. But something else that's important to remember is you can gain quite a bit of damage from doing something like this, because it's not just the ward flask that's up 100% of the time, it's also the Dying Sun, and the Bottled Faith, and the Quicksilver, making this a pretty darn OP build. Alternatively, we have a setup like this with the Coruscating Elixir. It is set up for massive burst damage on the Dying Sun, but each of the flasks should have relatively high uptime. The goal in this case is again to protect yourself because you're reserving all your life and otherwise you're going to end up dead. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a good way to search for this kind of stuff on PoE Ninja. You're going to have to know what flask people are keeping active and search for that instead of searching for the Traitor. But hopefully at some point in the future, there will be a way through GGG's API to tell who's using the Traitor and who isn't. That would certainly make searching a lot easier and open up a lot of builds that people just haven't played because they didn't know how to look for them, even though they're incredibly powerful. But now I'm kind of curious. What are some of the other cheesy mechanics or mechanical interactions that you find to be highly effective? One of my personal favorites is using high amounts of physical damage taken as elemental. Not only is this potentially good for negating or avoiding bleed damage, but it means you're able to tank a lot of very funny things, which are designed to kill you by overwhelming your armor. In fact, a lot of people struggled in early Trial of the Ancestors because the Rongo Kurai units automatically overwhelmed armor. So if you stacked armor to mitigate their physical damage, they then mitigated your armor and dealt massive damage to you. I came in with almost no armor, but a high amount of physical damage taken as, shifted their damage to elemental, rolled it against my resistances, and proceeded to laugh in their face. So be sure to share some of your favorite interactions or moments where you felt like you broke Path of Exile down in the comments below. If you're looking for something else to watch, check out my recent video on the mechanics of the Eye of Malice unique. Or alternatively, look at how I use Supreme Ostentation to min-max a Righteous Fire Juggernaut. Both of those will be up in the card and down in the description below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can make videos just like this possible, and for $5 a month, you can see your name on screen right now, just like these fine folks here. But with that said, thank you again for watching. I hope you learned something. I look forward to seeing your stories about weird and wacky but powerful mechanical interactions in Path of Exile, and I'll see you again sometime soon.